Today we begin a sermon series based on the story of the Exodus, the journey of God's people from slavery in Egypt to the edge of the promised land. The Exodus is the defining story of the scriptures of our Bible. Most scholars date the Exodus as happening around 1400 BC. And just to give you some context, the famous pyramids of Giza were built about 1,000 years before the Exodus happened, in 2400 BC. So contrary to, I think, popular opinion, the Israelites never built the pyramids. They helped the Egyptians build other things, probably temples and houses, but not pyramids. And it still blows my mind, maybe yours too, but it's incredible to think that when Abraham went to Egypt and when Moses was in Egypt, that the pyramids had been around for up to 1,000 years. And we can still see them today. We can look upon things that Abraham and Moses looked at. The Exodus not only describes Israel's origins, but it shapes the thinking of the rest of the Christian story. Jesus as the Lamb of God, our being redeemed by his blood, even our image of baptism and communion and Easter and Pentecost, our being rescued from the law of sin and death and so on, all of these things find their root in the story of the Exodus. So I thought it would be good for us as a church to spend a little time in this magnificent foundational story. I'm not exactly sure how long it'll go on for. I'll discover as we go, but I look forward to spending some time in this story. And we're going to focus most of our thinking around the life of Moses, who after Jesus is the next most significant person in our scriptures and who is the central character of this remarkable book. And I'm going to try and focus on Moses' life more than anything as a way to kind of edit and curtail the extent of our journey. Now, the beginning of the book of Exodus is a continuation of the end of Genesis. Clearly, the editors who put this together intended for Exodus to follow Genesis. And you'll remember, perhaps, from the Genesis book, that Joseph was the youngest favorite son of Jacob, who was given that multicolored coat as a sign of his favored status, and who was then sold on to human traffickers by his jealous brothers. Joseph then ended up in Egypt as a slave, but by God's favor and with many ups and downs, he eventually became the prime minister of Egypt. Then when famine struck the whole region, Joseph invited his father, his mom had already passed away, and then the same brothers who had sold him into slavery invited them all to come to Egypt, where they had plentiful stores of food. And so the book of Genesis ends with the death of Joseph, in which he's embalmed, he's mummified in the way that high-ranking Egyptians were in those days. And that's how the book of Genesis ends. And then the book of Exodus begins by reminding us of how those Hebrew people came to be in Egypt. And the way it happens is that we're given the names of Joseph's brothers, because it was that movement, that invitation of Joseph's, which brought them into Egypt. And so we're given the names of Joseph's brothers, and we're told that when they and their families arrived, that there were a group of about 70 people. Now, we don't take that number literally, because in true biblical fashion, we regard numbers like that as being more symbolic. And the number 70 would suggest there was a substantial clan of people, certainly enough to build a nation in the future. And then the time frame between verses 6 and 8 of our reading is 400 years. We get that from two other passages, one in Genesis and another later on in Exodus. And during those 400 years, this small group of people, for the moment, those 70 people, their numbers grow prolifically. And by this stage, Joseph had been forgotten by the new generation of leaders. 400 years had passed. And so the fondness that Egypt had had for Joseph, because he had rescued them in the midst of the famine, that had been forgotten. And so this new Pharaoh, who sometimes is called a king in our reading, if you don't mind, I'll use those phrases interchangeably too, instead of remembering the Hebrews as being Joseph's people, instead of treasuring them and thinking fondly of them in the light of their history, instead he sees them as some kind of a threat. He thinks that they could get so large in number, create an army of their own, and overthrow the government. And so instead of embracing them as fellow Egyptians, he continues to regard them simply as dangerous foreigners after 400 years of being residents in the land. That's what we call xenophobia. And then with no other reason but fear, Pharaoh decides to subject the people of Israel, the descendants of Joseph, he decides to subject them to hard labor as an attempt to slow down their population growth. That's his clear intent. He wants to make life so hard for them that they would stop growing in number. But verse 12 in our reading today says, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. The Egyptians crushed them in case they multiplied, but because they were crushed, they multiplied all the more. And then this rapid population growth by the Israelites made the Egyptians loathe them even more deeply than they had already. So the king, the Pharaoh, then instructs the midwives, and we're given their names, Shiphrah and Puah. They are instructed to kill all the boys at birth. And we assume that Shiphrah and Puah were not the only two midwives in Egypt at the time, and that there would have been a much larger group of midwives, and these two women probably oversaw that group. Anyway, Shiphrah, just if you're interested, means beauty. Puah means either girl or the word murmur, like the sound of a mother might make to soothe an infant. But that's not particularly relevant for our story today. It's just a little bit of interest. Anyway, so these two women are asked on behalf of all the other midwives to kill the boys at birth. And remarkably, in some ways, the midwives refused to obey the king. And why I say remarkably so is because this is a life-threatening choice. It's them or us. And so when the king questions their disobedience and asks why they didn't do what he told them to do, they just tell him a straight-out lie. And it's a lie that I really am convinced in the original Hebrew telling would have made the audience laugh. Because it feels as though in the story they harness the ignorance of the king when it comes to matters of gynecology and obstetrics. They simply say that the Hebrew women are so vigorous, is the word, they are so vigorous that they give birth before anyone has a chance to be able to get their hands on the children to kill them. Undeterred, the king seems not to argue or question that answer. Instead, he resorts to a radical decision, and he gives permission to all Egyptians to kill Hebrew infant boys by drowning them in the Nile River. His fear-filled decision is immoral and irrational, and yet in its own way it's measured, it's considered. By killing all the boys, he limits population growth, but at the same time he diminishes his future manual labor force. But he can compensate for this loss, by ensuring that there are enough girls for sexual exploitation and for domestic and agricultural labor. Agricultural labor was the key thing in Egypt. That was the kind of the key industry more than manual labor per se. Now, we aren't told exactly how effective this infanticide is, and I'll talk about it briefly a little later. But it is into this threatening environment, this infanticide environment, that a little boy is born to two Levites. His mom managed to hide him for 3 months, but the bigger he got, the more he grew up, the harder it became to hide him. And so she made the only decision she could. She made a waterproof basket and placed it in the river near where the Pharaoh's daughter would often visit. And Pharaoh's daughter understood exactly what was happening here. When she finds a baby boy abandoned in a basket on the river, it had to be a Hebrew boy. And that was a boy she was supposed to drown according to her father's instructions. But compassionately, she arranges that the child will instead be nursed by his own mother. And the mother therefore receives her child back for just a few years, but better than nothing, I suppose. Eventually, though, the mom now has to return the child to Pharaoh's daughter, and the word is there that she adopts him. He legally becomes her son. And she names him Moses, which is a good Egyptian name. And in Egyptian it means the one who is born, or simply, this is my son. The Hebrew version of that Egyptian name means to draw water, for Moses was drawn from the water. So this is the Sunday before South Africa goes to the polls, before we are involved with an election. And although this sermon isn't designed around those things, I try to keep in mind that that's what's coming up this week. And so these are some general observations out of the passage. They're simple. I hope you'll find them helpful. But perhaps in the back of your head, you can also think how they might inform some of your thinking around voting this week. The first thing I want to say is that we as human beings make terrible decisions when we react or respond to life out of fear. Built into the survival mechanism of many living creatures is some form of fear. I don't know about you, but I'm endlessly intrigued in my home that ants and flies and mosquitoes and the mouse that might come into your house every now and then, with their very little brains, can perceive danger. How does a mosquito know to avoid your slapping hand, or a fly to avoid the swatter? They've barely got room there for anything. But as much as fear can be our internal alarm system built into us as living creatures, when that fear gets the better of us, we can end up making terrible decisions. I know it's an often referred to picture, but it's one I have to mention today, is that Hitler, who was a skilled orator, was able to awaken such deep fear in what were really otherwise good people. Many of the people that Hitler, in a sense, appealed to were actually Christian people, church-going Christian people, not just Christians by name. And in just a few years, relatively short time, 10 to 20 years at the most, the German people moved from being that kind of people who would have been religious and devoted in some manner. They moved to being the kind of people who supported the killing of over 6 million people, most of whom were Jews. How does that happen? Don't ever underestimate the power of fear to distort your worldview and your view of other people. The Hitler-Nazi story is the cold reminder that people like you and me, when fear gets the better of us, can turn us into people we don't recognize. And our world at the moment is currently in the grip of fear politics. It's been a thing that has come to the fore in recent years. And that fear politics gives power to people and policies that are at least as cruel as Pharaoh in our story, and perhaps even dangerously close to being as cruel as someone like Hitler. And before I move off of this thing, just to say, it's not only obviously in world politics, in any circumstances of our life, we typically make terrible decisions when they're made out of a place of fear. I want to leave that observation there for the moment because I want to take us to a second thought that's related to it. The other side of the coin, I think, is to say, although we might make terrible decisions in the midst of fear, the best of us emerges when we make loving choices in our life. A little bit of a digression for a moment, but I am still on the same point, I assure you. I just want to say I have absolutely no idea how the Christian church became beset by so much misogyny. And I won't go down that road too far, but just to say that I don't know how the church got marred by so much misogyny. Because this foundational story of our faith begins with the bravery of 4 women, each of whom is motivated by love. And without these women, there is no Moses. And you might want to argue about what might have happened and what God might have done instead. But with no Moses, there would be no Israel in this story, and then there might be what else down the road. And so you ask yourself, with this story as the starting point of the whole Christian story, and women being central at the resurrection of Jesus, at what point did the church decide that women somehow should be silent in church and second-rate citizens in the kingdom of God? I find it mind-boggling. I wanted to leave it out of my sermon because it can be a bit of distraction, but I can't get through the sermon without mentioning that. How does that happen? I suspect there's some form of fear. Anyway, who could have imagined the consequences of the loving choices made by the women in our story? Through their loving choices, they gave birth to a whole people from whom the Messiah came. And I want to say to us today that you and I are made for this kind of love that we see in these women. Love which interrupts evil, love which confronts injustice, love which adds goodness into the world, love which transforms the lives of others. You and I are made for this. We are fulfilled. We will sense the completeness in us when we live lives of love like that. Shiphrah and Puah, Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' mother, Jochebed, we're not given her name in this particular story, but that was her name. Those 4 women inspire us again to be people who live lovingly in our world. And when I say lovingly, I don't mean sentimentally. I think that's where the kind of the train goes off the rails when we think in those terms. When I say lovingly, I mean we love deliberately. We live in a world where we look for opportunities in which we can invest the love of God into the circumstances of our life. And the best of us emerges when we live a life determined to make loving choices on behalf of others. And then the third observation I want to make for our story today, and I often say this in my preaching, but I go, if I could have only preached one of these 3 things, this would be the one I would preach. And I want to say this as a kind of conclusion. I think the other observation I'd make out of the story is that standing up to evil is never a straightforward thing. Standing up, dealing with evil in our world, or even sin for that matter, is never a straightforward thing. You'll remember that Jesus said, "Be wise as serpents and gentle as doves." And in our story, I find it to be a delightful twist that the women lie to Pharaoh, at some measure to protect themselves, but very especially to protect the children. And the fact that they lie raises all kinds of ethical questions about lying, but we'll leave that for another day. There's no room for us in our sermon today. But what I do want to observe about this behavior on the part of the woman is that I want to say that I think there can be a certain naivety amongst good people in dealing with sin and evil. And when I say good people, I mean people in the Christian community. I think there can be a certain naivety. Instinctively keen to offer kindness. Sometimes our kindness can in fact add to the trouble because we overlook things we shouldn't overlook. Over the years, and I've been going to synods for decades now, literally, but over the years I've seen exam marks changed at a Methodist synod so an incompetent candidate can be advanced because the people in the room are such kind and good people and they don't want to see a candidate disappointed, and so they nudge them through. I've seen, as you would have, I know as well, I've seen addicts enabled by people who love them. And I've seen wrongdoing glossed over in the name of grace, of people not being confronted, of there not being accountability in the name of grace. As we look towards the polls, we're reminded that at a national level, we have tolerated criminality and incompetence, not only in the name of greed, but also in the name of goodwill. I know this is a controversial thing to say, and I've got to be cautious because I actually say this sometimes privately and it seldom goes down well. But I sometimes wonder whether the goodness of Ubuntu, and it is a wonderful thing to which our country has given the world, but I sometimes wonder if the goodness of Ubuntu hasn't contributed in some ways, the distortion of Ubuntu, hasn't contributed in some ways to the tolerance of evil within our country. We kind of gloss over it in our desire to be kind and to be good. And in a violent and evil world, God's people can only be light when they grasp the nature of the darkness. They can only be the light when they grasp the nature of the darkness. And the midwives in our story know what's going on. And so at first they disobey. Then they muddy the waters with their nonsense story about high-speed births, vigorous high-speed births. And then it seems the general population don't buy into the call to drown the babies. It's not a Hitler thing. It doesn't get out of hand. I'm sure some of that happened, but it seems like there's no record of it having taken off in any particular way. And so we can confidently say today that Pharaoh was outsmarted by 4 women who, free from fear, who were wise as serpents, made loving choices in their life. And so as we live and as we vote, may we do so too, in the name of Christ. Amen.